Great. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. And we're pleased to have Dr. Eden Naby and Mr. David Woodward today for our presentation. I'm Baman Bakhtiari, Executive Director of the Basketball Institute. We are located in Salt Lake City, and this is our final webinar of the year. So we will start again in September. Let me first introduce our speaker today, Dr. Eden Naby, who is a cultural historian of the Middle East and Central Asia. She began her career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan and moved on to Columbia and received her PhD from Columbia University. She and her late husband, Richard Frye from Harvard University, who many of you know, initiated the Assyrian endowments at several universities that have helped to shape the holdings on modern Assyrians at Harvard University, Columbia, and Berkeley, among others. Among her many articles on Assyrians are the key introduction to Assyrians in former Soviet Union, a fantastic piece, everyone should read that, as well as the use of the pre-World War I Assyrian periodical press to analyze cultural progress. She has curated 5 exhibits about Assyrians and Middle East minorities with catalogues, and her forthcoming exhibit at the Sunnyvale Heritage Park Museum in California, started in 2022, will be a traveling exhibit to other parts of North America. Her forthcoming book, Assyrians of the Middle East, will be published this year. We are looking forward to that publication. Today's panel and presentation will be chaired by our good friend, Mr. David Woodward, who is a principal for David Woodward Associates in Seattle. He is also a senior advisor for global engagement for Seattle University. David leads in the development of multi-site organizations, marketing and outreach strategy. And for our Basketball Institute and the audience, you may be interested to know that David was born in Iran, where he spent his early youth and developed a fascination for languages and cultures of the world. As a result, he became fluent in Persian, French, and Arabic, and studied Greek, Hebrew, and German. He has undergraduate degrees from Carleton College in Minnesota and graduate degrees from University of Washington. He has a master's degree in Near Eastern languages, civilizations, and a master's degree of education in higher education. So we are very pleased to have David for today's presentation. David will summarize after Dr. Naby's presentation, and then we will go to question and answer. So we start with you, Dr. Naby. We are delighted to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this, to make this presentation. I'd like to thank the Basketball Institute, especially my friend John Limbert, who made the introduction. I want to also say that the exhibit in Sunnyvale, which is ongoing, was put together with funding from the Assyrian Foundation of America, a very generous donation, and others. And that this took place, we were able to organize this because there was a lot of cooperation among Assyrians from San Jose and Chicago in creating not just an exhibit that is historically very important, but also a catalog. And at the end, you will see on my slides the website for the exhibit. The exhibit was took about 2 years to organize and would not have happened except for an accidental visit to a leading Assyrian poet in Turlock. And that visit led to my discovery of about 150 letters that were written to a gentleman, an Assyrian doctor, eventually settled in Mountain View, who kept all these 150 letters that have become really very important as sources for the understanding of a 30-year period at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But my presentation today is not so much about the exhibit as it is about how the first people born in Iran came and settled in the United States, how they dealt with the acculturation, and how they dealt with the fact that so much was happening in Iran after 1914 that affected their families and affected their attitudes toward being in the United States. So let me go to my slides to share those with you, and we will begin. I can do this. I know I can do it. Okay. So the presentation, as I have said, is about specifically about an American Assyrian family that settled in this country about 120 years ago. But the story is a lot more complicated than that. The immigration evolution from Iran to the US began in the late 19th century because of the presence of American missionaries that had arrived in Urmi, that is Western Iranian Azerbaijan, in 1834. And they proceeded very rapidly to change the entire situation, cultural situation, religious situation, social situation for the Assyrians of the region. Why they focused on the Assyrians, I will not go into. There are plenty of people who have written about that. But it is important that they focused on the Assyrians and settled in Urmi, where most of the Assyrians were living in the villages. So they set up a lot of schools and such in the villages. But Assyrian immigration to the United States is not the first place to which that started labor immigration. The first one was to Russia. After that, the Assyrians came to the US for advanced studies, and then they began thinking about colony building, and they specifically used the word colony. And then the Americanization process, as instability settled on their part of Iran, and the Assyrians had to flee the region. They were interested in exerting influence on US-Iran relations to the extent that they could help the Assyrians who were being persecuted, to put it mildly. Now, I'm very happy to have come across Matthew Shannon's book, thanks to him for sending it to me, and especially the chapter by John Ghazvinian, which talks about US diplomatic relations with Iran, and how, I think for me, for this lecture, and very interesting is the fact that Armenians from Ottoman Turkey were held diplomatic positions initially, as well as Persians themselves, and later a few Assyrians joined in that mix. But in fact, in the United States in the late 19th century, the first people to come from Iran were the Assyrians because of the missionaries. So the Assyrian labor migration began in the 1880s. Educational migration begins about 1880s as well, mainly for theological training, then medical training, despite the existence of the Urmi Medical School from 1880. The Assyrians also did something rather unusual. They, in imitation in part of the missionaries and others who had come from the West to their part of Iran, they began to publish books in English, not in Assyrian, but in English about Iran itself. So the effect of the Assyrian presence in the United States, that is this early period, was the publication of books for an eager audience among Americans. They added to the availability of information about Iran to materials published by missionaries, British diplomats, travelers, and archaeologists. They also lectured widely, the educated ones, lectured widely on Iran at American venues such as YMCAs, churches, and community clubs. And for this, they used a series of slides that are available at the Library of Congress now, and which were also in the collection with the letters. Active on some university campuses, Columbia University, for example, was Abraham Yohanan, who came to the United States to get his degree and to work on the translation of the New Testament into New Aramaic, into Assyrian Aramaic, and stayed on to teach languages there until he passed away in 1925. He was also the person who provided scholarly help to major collections like the Metropolitan Museum. And that's all beyond this lecture, but there's a lot of material available on that topic. These are some samples of the books that the Assyrians published in the United States prior to World War I. There's a whole series of materials that are published during World War I, which take a completely different view of Iran because they were getting reports, the writers were getting reports of the persecutions. But these are the materials published before World War I. And as you can see, they are, the people who are writing these books are calling themselves Persian. And most of the books are about Iran's various aspects of Iranian culture, geography, history. So there's very little in these books about Assyrians. They were supposed to be commercially viable and available to the readers. Now, the region that the Assyrians come from is Urmi, and I have this, I have borrowed with permission this map from the Assyrian International News Agency. And the map was done about 1927. So some of the names won't be familiar to you. But the town of Urmi, which has returned from being Rizaya to being Urmi after 1979, at the time of the, before World War I, was a walled city and a market town for agricultural produce. So that area is agriculturally rich, and the Assyrians lived mainly in the villages, not in the city. The other town around which they congregated in villages was Salmas, Shapur Delman, these are the various names throughout history, which is a smaller market town close to Tsarist and Ottoman territory. The village on which we focused for this exhibit, quite accidentally because this is where the man was from, that the letters came to, is called Karajalu, and it is located on one of the river systems between Urmi and Salmas. And it is a village that had a mixed Armenian Assyrian population, but and there was a good deal of intermarriage there, but in this particular case, the family was only Assyrian. Now, the outline of the life of Joseph D. Joseph, very, very briefly. There's a lot about him because he kept a journal for 30 years. So we have a lot of information. We're hoping to do something with the journal as well. But a brief outline is that he was born in 1868. He got his elementary education at American mission organized village schools, secondary education in the city of Urmi at Galla, and he decided to come to the United States to get his medical degree, and he got it in Minneapolis. In 1894, he completed his degree, and then he interned in Brooklyn for 2 years. He decided to return to Urmi, that was his original plan, to return to Urmi in order to serve as a medical doctor. There was a great need for doctors. About 24 of them were trained eventually at the American Medical College, Westminster College, medical school. But he returned, he got his education here, as did several others that have written about it. And he returned to Urmi and was very soon employed by Ali Khan Vali, a Qajar sub-governor in various parts of Iranian Azerbaijan. However, Dr. Joseph returned to the United States in 1903, and he settled in Mountain View. And basically what I want to talk about later on, after we get over the part about Iran, is how he became interested in building a colony in the United States of Assyrians. He was not the first one. And also how he eventually gave up on that idea. So before you, we have a mystery photograph. The small picture is the engagement photograph taken in Brooklyn in 1896 of David Joseph, and his Irish fiance. So here's a man who has come as a single man intending to return and marry in Iran, as would have been the case with, as is the case with many others. But in fact, he meets this Irish woman born in Ireland, and they become engaged. And one of the presents he gives her is that Bible that she's holding. And there they are in a picture in the Ali Khan Wali album. There are more pictures of this family in that album of 400 photographs than any other single family outside the Qajar royal family. But this picture, which is on the cover of our catalog, has been floating around the internet for quite some time, but it has not been identified, and nobody could identify these people until we found this particular photograph of the family and realized that the people in this photograph are in fact the same people. So here is another photograph from that album showing Dr. Joseph with Ali Khan Wali sitting in the center and another Qajar official next to them. So as you can see, Dr. Joseph is clad in Western clothing, and Assyrians very early on in the late 19th century began to wear Western clothing, especially the men. So the letters, I'm only going to show you about, I'm going to show you 3 letters from this collection that is going to go into Berkeley to be archived at Bancroft Library. This is one of the earliest letters from 1889, and it is written by one of the American missionaries, Mr. St. Pierre, who was in charge of the college during the time during a brief period when Dr. Joseph was there. And as you can see, it is a very simple matter of appointing him to collect tuition. But Dr. Joseph kept all of these letters. And that's what's amazing. Not only that he kept them all, but that the family, his descendants, also kept them. Okay. All right. Here is another letter from an Armenian from Urmi, a carpet seller, who is asking Dr. Joseph to help him sell carpet. So there's a great variety of letters in this collection with many different subjects. Some of the most historically interesting letters come from the British in Iraq at a time when the question of where to settle the Assyrians who had fled Iran and who had fled Turkey should go. So this is a letter from Mosul in which the writer is saying, he's a British official, he's saying that the Assyrians should probably immigrate to the US or Canada because there is no other place for them. And of course, that process of trying to get the Assyrians to immigrate became a League of Nations issue, but it never really was resolved, so that the immigration took place in trickles. So that's just a sampling of the letters that we have. that are going to be available for scholars to examine, to look at the modern period, modern history of the Assyrians. Now, one of the things that Dr. Joseph did when he settled in Mountain View, California, was to publish a periodical. Now, Assyrians were encouraged by the missionaries' efforts to publish periodicals. And the first periodical published in Iran was in 1849 and published by the missionaries with Assyrian editors and mostly Assyrian writers. It's also the place where I think, but I'm not absolutely sure, where I think that the Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was published in a local language. So it is quite an important publication, that one from 1849 to 1918, a very long-running publication. But it is also one that is almost completely lost. We're not able to retrieve it. And one of my projects is to try to retrieve the full collection so that it can be digitized. But so far we haven't succeeded. But in addition to that, there were many periodicals that the immigrants published in this country. And this is an example of one of them from 1919, published by Dr. Joseph. But it is, as you can see, parts of it are in Assyrian Aramaic, but most of it is, but there are some, I'm sorry, most of it is in Assyrian Aramaic, but there are parts of it that are in English. So in this first issue, he's talking about why they're publishing this. And part of the masthead, as you can see, reads to Americanize. It's a weekly Syriac journal of current events and as building and Americanizing. This is a bi-coastal publication. Okay, this is a bi-coastal publication. Sorry, I think I'm missing something from that's coming through. Let's see. It's a bi-coastal publication published together with a man who has become quite famous or infamous because he was the author of a still in print book called The Rage of Islam. He was an Assyrian who saw what was happening in Urmi, the attacks, the pillaging, the killing, the usual things that accompany war when the Ottoman army marched into that part of Iran. And he therefore wrote a book that was about Assyrians this time, but very anti-Islamic, as you can see, as you can figure out from the title. It appears in many languages now. And as I say, it's still in print. The man was quite active in the Assyrian community. And Dr. Joseph was certainly influenced by him. They were old friends. And he then brought out this publication, which only lasted 2 years. And it talks about the immigrant influence. And he very much wants to see Assyrians come to California and settle in agricultural areas where they would be have a life that was very similar to the one that they had in Iran. Now, Dr. Joseph lived in Iran with his wife for about 7 years, and several children were born to them there. 2 of them survived, and one of them was Gertrude Joseph, who was born in Karajalu, the village that we have focused on. And she eventually came with her family and settled in Mountain View, went to local public schools, and she graduated Stanford University. Now, Stanford was not a very old university at the time, but it was one that had a lot of foreigners attending, especially from the subcontinent and Armenians from Ottoman Turkey, as well as regular Americans from various parts of California mainly. I have tried to see in the archives of Stanford, not directly, but through their archivists, to see if they can identify people from their place of birth. And frankly, they haven't come back to me to tell me that they can. But Gertrude became a member of something called the Cosmopolitan Club. If those of you who've looked at things like American history and the Red Scare and that sort of thing, the Cosmopolitan Club plays a very important role in organizing students. It began in Northern Italy, but it was very important at various US campuses, including Stanford. So I've looked at the list of members of the club, and there are a lot of foreigners, and there are some Armenians, but all of them are born outside Iran. That is to say, the Armenians are from the Ottoman parts of the Armenian diaspora. So it looks to me like she is, in fact, the first person born in Iran who graduates Stanford University. Gertrude went on to be a school teacher. Her daughter, it's her daughter's family that has preserved all of these materials that we now have either going into the exhibit or going into various archives. So we're very grateful to that family, even though they're highly Americanized. I don't think they know any Assyrian language at all, although they do know some of the foods. But they kept these materials because they knew that this was part of their heritage. And the fact that they kept these materials, especially the letters, is going to be very helpful in understanding just how Assyrians from Iran made that transition from being people who want to return to Iran, as Dr. Joseph did, to people who, after seeing what happened in World War I, have decided that there is no place for them in Iran. And so they have then become very Americanized. So in terms of Iranians and this new immigration that has occurred, what happened to the Assyrians between 1914 and 1924 is comparable to the reasons, the instability that has driven so many Iranians, general Iranians, that is to say, all sorts of ethnic groups as well as Persians, into diaspora. And I think it is instructive to see how the Assyrians in this early period transitioned from being students in the United States or those who were here to make a pot of gold and return to Iran to buy vineyards, how they transitioned from that attitude to realizing that they had to remain in this country in order to be secure and to bring their families with them. But that meant that their culture and their language were in danger, because how can you have an Americanization process where your children go to schools and learn English, come home and speak Assyrian, but at the same time, there is an enormous loss of writing ability, reading in the language, and there are virtually no institutions to promote that process, the writing. So I am just listing here the 8 ways in which the Assyrians have tried to retain their culture in this American diaspora. It's a little bit different in Europe. I can't go into that. But in the United States, first, there was a huge shift with regard to their attitude toward Iran because of what happened in the First World War. Second, the after World War I and before the Immigration Act of 1924, there was a huge Assyrian migration, a huge by Assyrian standards, migration to places like Chicago and California and the East Coast. And then very active, of course, was this Americanization process. The formation of Assyrian American secular institutions, periodicals and neighborhoods then began to form. So Chicago, even today, has the largest concentrated collection of Assyrian Americans in this country. Some of the neighborhoods have broken up. Some of the periodicals have do not exist anymore, but secular institutions do, as do the churches. But the Assyrian situation in this country is complicated by the fact that there have always been trans-border Assyrians, Assyrians who lived in the Ottoman Empire, those who lived who eventually moved to Lebanon, or Syria, and of course there's the ones that were in Iraq itself. So as various Assyrians from other parts of the Middle East began to come to the United States, then there was a question of how do Assyrians from Iran mix or work with these other Assyrians who oftentimes were not nearly as well educated as the Assyrians from Iran because they simply had not had the same advantages. And they also did not speak Persian, oftentimes did not speak the same Turkish as the other Assyrians, and some of their dialects in Assyrian were quite different too. The later migration brought people whose primary written language was Arabic, and that too complicates how Assyrians from various parts of the Middle East will be able to work together if their main language, the Assyrian Neo-Aramaic, begins to fail, as it's beginning to. So among these Assyrians, I skipped number 7, I see, among these Assyrians is an escalated use of English for intercommunal communication, especially in print. And there is a rise in intermarriages with co-religionists of different ethnicities. So for example, not just Armenians, which are the closest in many ways to Assyrians, but also with Irish, Polish, Italians, and so on. When I was growing up in Philadelphia, there were several Polish Assyrian families where the women spoke perfectly good Assyrian and made perfectly good dolma. Now, how does globalization of the immigrant experience and stemming the tide of loss of language and culture work among Assyrians? What do they do to try to prevent it? In the Assyrian case, and this may be instructive for the Persian-speaking ones as well, Persian-speaking immigrants as well. In the Assyrian case, the issue of relations with the Middle East is a highly debated and divisive one. In many cases, the stake has been set to be in northern Iraq. That is, northern Iraq is the last stand of the Assyrians, not in Iran. The numbers in Iran are much reduced, where although there is still representation in the Majlis, the numbers are perhaps a fifth of what they were before 1979. So the emphasis is on aid to northern Iraq, the preservation of schools in northern Iraq, and it is, of course, problematic because Iraq also is not a very stable place, has not been for the Assyrians, and the ISIS taking over of much of the areas that were Assyrian in northern Iraq has certainly damaged people's idea of security. There is the danger of the loss of modern history, not medieval or ancient. And this is true in the case of Iran in general. Almost everyone has some idea of Taht Jamshid and Persepolis and Iranian history, ancient history, and that will certainly survive at institutions in Europe, Russia, Japan, and the United States. And that is also true to a great extent for medieval history and medieval poetry, medieval writings of various historical sources, and so forth. Those will probably continue because it is not they're not divisive issues. But modern history is divisive. And for the Assyrians too, and perhaps for the general Iranian community, the writing and the understanding of modern history are affected by many factors that are controversial. So what the Assyrians are doing to try to stop this melting in the United States, and I see evidence of that in the Iranian immigrant community as well, is to create secular institutions together with the churches, sometimes not with the churches, but secular institutions to try to maintain culture and ties among the community. There are also attempts to build institutional ties at American universities. There are private language and culture classes, especially on the internet, that may make a dent in the melting of Assyrian culture. And there are community cultural events, especially in the arts. And here I want to mention the Assyrian Arts Institute, a relatively new organization that is beginning to find its direction and create, especially on the internet, create some viable ways of maintaining Assyrian arts internationally. And then finally, we are quite involved in archiving of modern Assyrian materials. The discovery of the Ali Khan Valley album at Harvard is an encouraging fact, because for us, having found ourselves in that album means that we had some value then for that gentleman, and that we have some value for ourselves as well, and we should try to do that sort of thing instead of dumping things in the trash. So we are in the process of enlarging that archiving possibility, and hope that we can work with the Iranian community, since a lot of our archives are Iran related, that we can work with the Iranian community in order to promote these kinds of activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naby. It was really interesting to go through that history with you and get some insights about that history, which is so unique in a lot of ways. And for me personally, I really, my own story kind of resonates with this story. When you talk about Americanization, I was going through perhaps the reverse of that. I was going as a child in Iran, born in Tehran, growing up in Ahvaz. I was going through an Iranian acculturation as a child, and adapting to the local, getting to know local kids and going to homes locally and learning about eating the local foods. And then later on, we left Iran in 1968 at the end and came back to the States. And I felt like, and this sort of mirrors a little bit of the experience of people who might come to the U.S. and then want to go back. Growing up there, coming to the U.S., I wanted to go back to Iran. And perhaps my whole life really in a lot of ways has been defined by that interest in going back. And so I studied various Middle Eastern languages and so forth in order to keep those alive and in order to re-engage back with the people of the region. So I really, I find this really a fascinating story. And it's important work that you're doing, archiving and also very interesting, this connection for me as a child raised Presbyterian to learn through Dr. Humanis Dalami's work about his research in Urumia and the Protestants and Presbyterians there in the 1800s, and then your work on top of that and the Assyrian community, the history of all of the various dimensions of the Christian civilization. When we look at the Assyrians in particular, boy, you can't get more to the root of Christian history, really, when you start looking at Assyrian history and its faith tradition. So that's really interesting. And I would just comment that in my own experience, of all the people of the region who have been moving around from place to place and adapting, it seems like Assyrians, in a sense, are among the most adaptive of people as a result, with multilingual skills and abilities because they were forced to, in many cases, move from place to place. And so it's interesting because I felt that as a child, that the Assyrian family in particular that we knew well in Ahvaz, the Hangali family, I was really struck by how they seemed very comfortable in Iranian culture, but also they seemed very comfortable in dealing with us as people from outside Iran. And then some of them, of course, have moved to the U.S. We've met in the U.S. They seem very comfortable in the U.S. So these are people that seem to really adapt well. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with you as well, the adaptive capability?
Well, as you have said, they have to adapt. Perhaps they have honed their language skills to a point where they can do that in almost any setting. The problem with that situation, with their adaptability, though, is that if they adapt to English, for example, or if they adapt to French, and then they lose their Neo-Aramaic, how are they going to talk to each other? And that has become a pretty serious problem, as a very large contingent of Assyrians from Turkey since the 1960s have immigrated to Germany, Sweden, Holland, and they are speaking those languages. Fortunately, English is such an international language that in many cases, they also know English. But the adaptability to their environment, which is required for them to survive, means that they become separated from each other in terms of language. This is why the loss of Aramaic, which is the oldest alphabetically written language in the world, the loss of Aramaic as a spoken and written contemporary language is a very serious one. And groups like the Foundation for Endangered Languages are quite interested in this, but what's to be done? What's to be done? It's a difficult situation to resolve, because unlike the Armenians, and even the Armenians are losing language, but they have at least books published in Yerevan and materials published in Armenia that can support their language efforts. The Assyrians don't have that. So the loss of Aramaic is a very serious issue, both for international communication among Assyrians and also simply as a language of culture.
That's a really interesting point. I've spent a lot of time in linguistics and language acquisition and education, and it does seem that worldwide that the language is so critical to identity in so many cases because of how we express ourselves, right? In this language or that, and those of us that have used different languages, we realize that we feel like a different person when we shift into another language. I speak Arabic, and I feel like a different person when I speak Arabic. Likewise with Farsi or French, you feel like you become almost a different version of yourself. It's very interesting. I would just comment, because I think we want to go to some questions pretty quick. And one of the things that Bahman and I have talked quite a bit about as I've got to know him and the Baskerville Institute is the importance of really building relationships with places like the people in the people of Iran, for example, and the people of Iraq, I would add, places that throughout my 40-year career, I've gone back and forth to that region, to Central Asia and places around. I haven't been able to go to Iran, unfortunately, due to the revolution, but I would like to go when I can, and it's appropriate to do so. But one of the things that we're working together on is how do we instill an interest in the U.S. side in the peoples of that region, and how do we nurture and engage people in relationship building and friendship building. One of the things that I often talk about, and I've talked my whole career to groups in the U.S., church groups, college groups, whatever, about my own family history. And as I heard Dr. Estelami's presentation and now yours, I've been struck more and more by the fact that my own family has a connection back to the mid-1800s in Urmia because of the Cochrane family. So for those who don't know on this call don't know this, the first Cochrane was Dr. Joseph Gallup Cochrane, and he arrives in Urmia in 1848. His son, Dr. Joseph P. Cochrane, was born in 1855, and he is a major historical figure, right, in Urmia area. And then his son, Joseph Cochrane Jr., Dr. Joseph Cochrane Jr., and I don't know the year he was born. I'm guessing 1880s or so, maybe 1890s. Yeah. He ends up going back to Iran in 1820. He recruits my mother in 1946, who, as a single woman, got on a ship with the Cochranes, Joe and Bernice Cochrane, to go to Iran. My father's trying to get her to marry him and go to China, and she refused. So he has to change his entire life plan from going to China. He was a missionary kid in the Philippines, Presbyterian. He follows her over to Iran. They get married in Meshed. I have two sisters born in Meshed, and the Cochranes are the godparents of my sisters. So you go from 1848 in Urmia to today, that sort of family connection. I feel like a fifth generation, Presbyterian with a life in Iran, right? And it's like, wow, it's not as ancient history as we think. That's the thing that hits me, is we have direct personal connections back to these, quote, historical figures. And of course, in your case, it's family. But I think in American society, one of the things that's always struck me is the sense that anything that isn't in my immediate experience is ancient history. It's almost irrelevant to me. That old movie or that old TV show or whatever, it's like, it's passé. It's like 10 years ago. And, and I just think, man, we are still connected deeply into that history. And I'm so appreciative of the Baskerville Institute for really making this the focus of let's now really understand how deep our roots go in relation to these two cultures. So, thank you, Kim, for your comment. Kim, a colleague of mine from Portland State who has taught Farsi, and it's great to see you on there. Bahman, let's go to some Q&A. I saw a couple of questions. Do you want to bring one up?
Absolutely. Thank you, Aidan, for that fantastic and such an informative presentation. And I have to go back to your slides again and read them over again, because each slide, I think, was like a book chapter.
Yes.
So I'm so
Unfortunately,
glad
one has to race through these things.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad that you have brought that subject up. And as David mentioned, really 43 plus years of this mutual Satanization between the government of Iran and government of the United States has really distracted us from century plus friendship that had been happening with Dr. Cochrane, founding of the medical school, even Howard Baskerville, right, and so forth. And it is so important for us to revive that cultural friendship history to inform the Americans that relation with Iran did not begin and end with 79 revolution. So I'm so glad that you brought these subjects. I hope we can have you again. We didn't get a chance to talk about the exhibit in California a little bit, and how also that is an important informative aspect of informing the public about this history. So we're getting a lot of questions now, and we'll start with, I think you both can see the questions in the question and answer. Dr. Alexander Mirza Mogaddam has asked the question, who paid for Dr. Joseph to study medicine in the US?
Well, this man, Dr. Joseph, was loquacious. He has a journal that runs to 2 volumes. So he writes minutely about all of these issues. He was very concerned about the economics of his life. In his case, he begged and borrowed money. He sold door-to-door Bibles. He lectured. The lecturing was a very important part of what he was getting. So he was getting, with a good slide lecture, he was getting something like, I think, $10 from a church. And for that time, that wasn't bad. I'm not getting anything for this lecture. Am I getting $10 for this lecture? No. So he collected his own money to do this. He left Iran with a little bit of money from his father, who was a carpenter, not a wealthy man. That's what he had in his pocket to make that journey through Russia, Germany, and over to the US. But here he tried to make his own money. He also went to his missionary contacts in the US in order to raise money from them. But basically, the American missionaries in Urmi were not in favor of Assyrians coming to the US to study. They wanted them to study there and continue their work there, whether it was in medicine or theology, or eventually pre-engineering too. But the Assyrians expanded into many fields under the missionary guidance. So yeah, he had to make his own money. He didn't have scholarships. He just went around and got money from various churches. But the lecturing was a very important part of it. In fact, he had enough money to go to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. So it wasn't as if he was starving, but he had to make his own way.
That's very interesting. Another person, Vicky Shemia, asked a question: where did the Assyrians worship after they immigrated to the US or the West?
Yes, very, very good question that'll bring me to some of the divisions in the Assyrian community. The Assyrian community in Iran was initially solely Church of the East. And if you recall, the Church of the East is the one that went to China and to southern India and converted various groups. So it's a missionary church. It converted both Indians and Mongols and Chinese to Christianity, Church of the East. So we have plenty of evidence on that, plenty of writing on that. That's one of the reasons why when the Mongols attacked Iran and the Ilkhanate Empire was set up, they were so friendly to Christians and Jews, because a lot of them were Christians already from the Church of the East. So when the Assyrians came to this country, by that time in the 1880s, a lot of them were Protestant, a lot of them were Presbyterian. So they set up initially small churches. They did not build their own churches. They were not enough of them, or they were not wealthy enough. So they would worship in American or existing churches, Protestant churches, where they would hold services for their community. And that worked out very well. In fact, that's how my father preached in Philadelphia. He preached at the Gaston Presbyterian Church, which had a long tradition of hosting Assyrian Presbyterians. But in places like Chicago, where the numbers grew rapidly, even before World War I, they began to build their own churches. So some of the first churches were Protestant churches, but eventually there were also Catholic churches, and much later, the Church of the East. The Church of the East is late because that immigration is from Iraq, mainly in Syria, because that's where the Church of the East flourished among the refugees. And they don't come until much later to the United States because of the various immigration acts. It's not until the 60s that door is opened for them. So they made do. They brought pastors there were plenty of pastors being trained by the missionaries in Urmi. So they brought them over. And then there were also Catholics being trained. So they brought them over and had services that way. But in some cases, the churches were not as cooperative with each other as they might be. So the secular organizations like the Assyrian American Federation, National Federation, was a key group, started in about 1933, was a key group in having annual gatherings where people met and married and danced and talked and kept the language going.
Very good. Dr. Mirza Mohaddam has another follow-up question for you. What influenced this Iranian Assyrian MD to leave Iran? My grandfather, who was an MD, educated in the American College of Medicine in Urmi in 1910, stayed there serving as a patriotic Assyrian nationalist Iranian until his death in 1946.
There were a lot of doctors like Alexander Mirzayev, his father, who were trained in Urmi and remained in Urmi. But there also are a substantial number, I'd say a good maybe 5 or 10 in that period, who were trained in the US or in Russia. So why did they not stay and go to the college in Urmi? It's not clear from Dr. Joseph's journal at all. He doesn't say why he wanted to leave. But we know that when he came back, in the Ali Khan Wali album, it's very clearly written that he was recommended for this high position, very well-paying position, with the Qajar sub-governor. He was recommended because he'd been trained in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that had some monetary value and perhaps other career value as well for him. So that is why he came to the US. Why he left Iran, though, only has to do with the health of his wife. His wife, with whom he was very, very close, was kept getting sick in Iran. She lived in Karajalu. It was a place where they had lost children already. They had lost their first child. It was a place that Urmi had a lot of malaria, which is why the missionaries went up to Syria into the mountains especially in the summer. There were waterborne diseases. You belong to a generation that didn't suffer from these things, but I lived in Urmi until I was 10 years old. I had typhoid twice, whooping cough, all kinds of things. These things happened to the missionaries. They happened to his wife. And so Bertha, his wife, simply could not manage her health in Iran. Perhaps if she were living in Urmi, she would have. But she lived in Karajalu in a village with his family. They had a separate house, but it was with his family. And it was just really health-wise very difficult for her.
Yeah, I think it's hard for us today to understand the level of poverty if we go back a century or a century and a half in many areas. It's just hard for us even now, in a sense, to conceive of the problem of lack of food and medicine and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Well, it wasn't so much lack of food. I mean, there were famines that he records in his journal at various times, but the real issues were medical ones.
Yeah.
The lack of sanitation.
Yeah.
Water systems. I mean, if you had a well of your own, it was something else. But Urmi Rizariye did not get a general water system, Lulakashi, until the 1960s.
Yeah.
And even then, there were people who were complaining, they just put this Lulakashi in so that we would have to pay for the water instead of our own wells. But in fact, it was a major sanitary move.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Dr. Cochrane's Urmia College or medical clinic, he was super busy with people arriving there, right, with all kind of problems. And he also, according to our colleague Human Estelami, has done a lot of research, he also got engaged in helping with the tribal leaders to make it more easier for these people to come to his clinic.
Yes. Yes, I think one of the marvelous things about this whole medical school and how it functioned in Iran is how much help they were able to give to the Kurds, especially because they traveled to the Kurdish areas. I mean, it's not as if they were doing it for free, obviously, but they traveled to Kurdish areas, including Dr. Joseph, and there they performed all the medical services that were available at the time. So it wasn't just Dr. Cochrane, who apparently served almost 13,000 people in his first year there, but also it was just the Assyrian doctors, too, who went around to a lot of the different parts of Azerbaijan, all the way down to Kermanshah.
Wow. So the next question is from our colleague, Professor Estelami, who has written this excellent book of American.
Oh, marvelous book, marvelous
excellent book.
Yes.
We will send a link to it after this question.
Yes.
In the correspondences of Dr. Joseph, have you found any communications with American missionaries from Urmia who had moved back to the U.S.? In general, did the Assyrians who moved to U.S. stay connected with missionary families who also had moved back to the US?
I think he's read all the correspondence, and I haven't read it all yet. In the case of Dr. Joseph, yes. In fact, some of the prominent issues that he raises in his journal are with American missionaries who have either come here to visit or who have come on sabbaticals or who have retired and are living back in the United States. So there is a lot about his connection with the missionaries, and some of the more controversial issues that are raised in his life, not by him, but we, as we look back on it, has to do with the use of the term for Assyrians, which the missionaries insisted should be Syrian initially, and then they switched over to Persian. It makes using those Presbyterian Historical Society archives very difficult because they talk about Persians and you never know who they're talking about. But so he had this one issue with the American missionaries, the name of the ethnicity and then the name of the language. And the name of the language is still a problem with the Library of Congress. And it's one of the ones that we have to tackle because they keep saying that it's Syriac. And frankly, I can't understand classical Syriac, neither can any of my Assyrian friends who have ever studied Assyrian, because classical Syriac, it would be like saying, you know French, therefore you should understand Latin. Well, you can't. Can you, David?
Some, if it's in English. This is a good question or comment here from Anna. Diaspora communities grapple with identity and heritage. Heritage is not equivalent to identity nor to identification. Assyrian communities in the Middle East have tangible heritage they can identify with. However, Assyrians in diaspora do not. Besides language, what other aspects of heritage can Assyrians in diaspora identify with? And then following up on my question, I'm referring specifically to secular heritage that Assyrians in the diaspora can identify with. So this is all about sort of thing I think you're focusing on here.
Yes, I don't see the question, but it's a very good one. Complicated one, but a good one. The secular part of it has been a problem because it is so easy to focus on the ancient period. It's visually attractive. It's in all of the major museums, and you go over and you stand next to a lamasu and have your picture taken and say, "See, this is my heritage."
My ancestor.
Well, no, not a lamasu. We're not bulls and lions yet. But the question then becomes, what is your contemporary heritage? What is it that you can hark back to? Aside from language, and if you're losing language, then what do you have? We have mythological history, which is very important. Iranians, for the general Iranian population, there is nothing perhaps more valuable than the Shahnameh as a keeper of culture. The Assyrians have similar kinds of things that exist that can be and are being used for heritage, secular heritage. So one of the most important ones of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is really the first recorded epic in the world that we have discovered so far. It's not originally Assyrian, it's Sumerian, but it was published, it was preserved in the Ashurbanipal library in Nineveh. So, and that on 12 tablets, and those have all been translated and retranslated and often retranslated in light of what is later learned about cuneiform and about epic. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh is a very critical part of Assyrian identity in the same way that the Shahnameh is for Iranians in general, not just Iranians, but Central Asians. Not so much to the Afghans, but certainly to Tajiks and that sort of thing. So that there are certain aspects of this, but aspects of secular culture from the ancient period that can still be made alive today, and you don't have to go to a museum for it. So working on Gilgamesh, making it better known among the Assyrian community, is a very important part of how Assyrians are retaining their culture. And of course, just as the Iranians in the immigrant community are doing, the Assyrians also are concentrating on their foods and the historical development of food sources. For example, barley is traditionally very important in Assyrian cooking culture, and it was from the ancient period forward. Bulgur, which you find in ancient documents as well. So cooking is another way in which people are trying to preserve themselves. But perhaps the most popular and important is popular music. So for Assyrians, those poets and singers who sing in our language, those people are the key in many ways to preserving language as well as culture, because the songs that they sing often are not just love songs, although there's some of that. A lot of them are really patriotic historical songs dedicated to Nineveh, to the ancient habitat of the Assyrians, so that popular culture is very popular singers, whether they're wedding singers or whether they're party singers, whatever they are extremely important. So there's an event coming up in California, for example, called Mesopotamian Night that my fund has been supporting for many years, which is music, and it also is theater. So theater and music, some of it going back to ancient themes, some of them to modern themes, are very important in preserving secular culture. But one thing that has failed the Assyrian community is the existence of a periodical press. We simply don't have a really lively periodical press. And some of that has to do with the fact that the internet has stolen the thunder of print press. But the other has to do with just volunteers doing the work.
It's interesting. If you watch Netflix, there's a film that came out recently of a famous sort of heroic woman figure in Central Asia who defeats the Persian ruler of her day. And so this is kind of interesting. The Kazakh government funded them. So
I don't know about it.
It's very interesting to see sort of the redevelopment of sort of return to that ancient history as a part of promoting the value of the culture and so on. And it just
separation of identity.
Yeah, yes. And it sort of brings to mind that if there were the funds for the Assyrian diaspora to spend film, that would probably be very interesting to see what would emerge from that. I just read this one comment here. Hello, Eden. My father's paternal uncle Shamasha Rahana David actually was responsible for raising a Church of the East in Chicago, where I went with my father in the 1940s, and the name Narsai David.
Yes. So speaking of cooking, Narsai David is very critical. In fact, to promoting Assyrian and Middle Eastern cooking, his archives are going to go into Berkeley, because this man not only had a radio show about cooking, but had a famous restaurant, and he has been very, very active. So did Narsai give the date? I can't remember it. The date of that church. I don't.
He didn't say. He just said in the 40s.
Oh, okay, in the 40s.
Yeah. And then here's a provocative one. How was the relationship between the Assyrians and the Pahlavi dynasty in 1970?
Good.
Okay.
Well, of course, among the Assyrians, as among any minorities, especially in the Northwest, there was a great affinity with Tsarist Russia and then with Communist Russia. So Papa Stalin was a hero to many Assyrians, especially during the Peshawari period in the 1940s, because minorities have always felt, and in some cases, based on true fact, that they were being discriminated against. So Papa Stalin and his nationalities policy was a very attractive alternative. And so there were Assyrians, even through the 1970s, that had leftist leanings. I mean, a lot of them had immigrated and are not to Russia, but to the United States. So we have those kinds of things. But actually, in the 1970s, from about 65 on, Assyrians under the Pahlavi regime felt both secure and respected. And I think that's a rare instance.
Yeah. I was one of the
Minorities
things.
need to be respected. I think that's
Yeah.
a key thing, that
Yeah.
not condescended to, but respected.
Mhm.
And I think that happened in the Pahlavi period.
Yeah, it's interesting. You actually bring to mind a project that I've been working on. I was at Community School of Tehran for a very brief time. My siblings were there much longer. In one case, from 1954 to 1965, one of my siblings. So they have this very extensive experience with the community school, which was a Presbyterian school established in the mid 30s. And then it went through these later lives where huge numbers of Jewish students came from Iraq, for example, and when they had to leave Iraq, and
Yes,
then
yes.
later years, as the Presbyterians gave control over to the government, it became secularized. And one of the recent meetings we had online was really interesting because Dr. Matt Shannon has been doing research oral history, and it was interesting how there were no missionary kids in the group of 6 or 7 alumni, but they all talked about how great the chapel program was. and I think it was the point was that it promoted diversity of ideas and acceptance. The UN Day was a favorite of all the alumni. They all talk about, I was there for UN Day, that half year of 6th grade. I got to carry the Soviet flag, which is still today one of my proudest moments. Big, huge red flag with the sickle and hammer.
Yeah.
But there was that this sort of idyllic feeling of a lot of these students who grew up there and lived there and were there as expat kids and others from various parts of the world. There's almost 1,000 of them on this Facebook group that I manage, and they all talk about just what an amazing experience it was and how important it was to them. That's over 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So these people are keeping alive that memory, even though they can't even go back, and the school closed it in 1980. So I think going forward, I'd be interested in your thoughts on, we did talk a little about technology in music and film, but, is there a possibility of the Assyrian diaspora or wherever they are reconnecting more through technology in an online format?
There is, especially in the last 10 years, there's been an increase in things like podcasts, which are conducted, to my knowledge, either in English or from Russia, they are conducted in Assyrian. Now, some of them from Sweden are also in Assyrian and Aramaic. So there are multiple languages, and yes, this is taking place, but it's a question of how widespread they are. So there's also an Assyrian television network in San Jose that hosts many people over many experts discussions and such over the past 10 years, but they have a limited audience, and the audience is of a certain age group. So how do you reach the younger generation
Mm-hmm.
of Assyrians, even if they're brought up in speaking Assyrian, or at least knowing that they're Assyrian and understand the culture and are interested in it? There is a certain, and this is a pit that I think a lot of minorities fall into. Fortunately, not the Armenians. I think the Armenians have done very well. The pit is that we lose our vision of what is possible.
Mm-hmm.
So we say, oh, yes, we will look at the ancient period, rah, rah, rah. We will look at modern paintings maybe and some music, but we don't go beyond that to what a next step could be.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the archiving is perhaps going to open some doors. Now, somebody asked a question about the content of the letters. I think it was Human. We haven't read all those letters. No, we've translated 7 of them. The rest are going to go into archive. We've dated them, said who they're from and so forth, but we haven't read them. 80% of those letters are in Assyrian Irish. Somebody's going to have to read them to answer a lot of the questions. Fortunately, the journal is in English, so we can work with that. But one of the things that we need to do in the diaspora community is to consider the ways in which we can expand our cultural reach to other generations. And that's why I like exhibits, frankly, because they're visual. You get to see them. You get to publish something about them if people want to look at it in greater depth. And they work well. I'd like to see an exhibit on the community college. I bet you could have lots and lots of pictures and drawings and history, as long as you can textualize it so that it's within the context of its period in Iran, in Tehran, and the context of the Middle East and the world at the time. A lot of the problem with what Assyrians produced is that there's no context to it. This is what happened to Assyrians in 1933 without telling you why the Assyrians were there, what else was going on in the Middle East, and so forth. You have to contextualize the minority experience. Otherwise, it doesn't speak to other people, and it hardly speaks to yourself.
Yeah, and it is one of the things that we're working on together. Baskerville Institute, the Presbyterian Historical Society, archiving oral history and photos and other resources. So having a free online resource like that is certainly going to be important. But as you say, getting it out to a broader audience, to the younger population, that's not so easy to do. There is, in the Seattle area where I am, there is a Persian music and poetry meeting that happens monthly that's been going on for well over a decade, 15 years. And it's all in Farsi. And so, but again, I've gone a couple of times, and it's a certain demographic, right? It's typically not people in their teens or early 20s and sort of thing. But maybe technology again will be the answer to that, and
maybe
as it's more online and stuff.
But one of the blind spots, and I want to, and you may not agree with me on this, Bahman, but I think one of the blind spots in being in the diaspora is insisting on exclusive use of your own language. It really shuts the door to other people and to other generations. So we run into that problem in the Assyrian community. They want to publish something only in Assyrian. Why not give it a 5-page English introduction at least? No, this is for people who know Assyrian. But why? Pretty soon there are only going to be about 20 of them who are going to be able to read it. So what's the point? I think it's a problem with it's going to be a problem with Persian too, that if you're going to be monolingual in diaspora, you're just not going to survive. So that's my 2 cents.
Lydia, I agree with you. We bring interns to our institute every year. We had 3 interns this year from the Middle East Studies, Persian language, and a couple of the interns were not really good in Persian, but they had a fantastic understanding of the history. And they were really good in contextualizing. So we decided that having a good understanding of the culture and history is as important as the language. And by having them incorporated in our institute for the work, they were 2nd-generation Iranians. They started learning more Persian because they first understood the importance of the cultural context and how the language can be used for that context. So I totally agree with you. I think we need to bring more young Americans into the whole context that you talked about, understanding a diaspora and the 2nd-generation Iranians, 3rd-generation Iranians who have a good heart about Iran and Persian culture, but do not have a way of communicating in the language for them. So that is totally true. We got a lot of other questions. I think you addressed the question of the Pahlavi period. There was another question: were they open to Assyrians, and did they help Assyrians preserve their culture? Talking about the Pahlavi period.
During the Pahlavi period in Tehran and in Urmi, and I'm not sure about Kermanshah, Ahwaz, but in Abadan as well, there was a flourishing of Assyrian schools. These were government, I guess funded totally, but I'm not sure of that part of it. These were government schools where the language was promoted in the context of a Persian environment. So this is true in Abadan. In fact, the principal of the school is living in Los Altos, California. And it certainly was true in Tehran and in Urmi. So schools for promoting the language existed during the Pahlavi period and were helped by the government. After 1979, when the new regime consolidated itself, it insisted on putting into high administrative positions non-Assyrians, and also teaching the Quran. So these were some critical moves that were made that discouraged Assyrians from their school systems. That, plus the reduction of the population through immigration, has damaged the teaching of Assyrian Neo-Aramaic in Iran. If I had my wish, a lot of these countries that have such a strong history in the use of Neo-Aramaic, the Pahlavi alphabet is based on Aramaic. Hebrew has a strong Aramaic influence. Syria is named after the Assyrian Empire. All of these countries would adapt Aramaic as a language, not as a primary language, but as a language to honor and promote. But will they understand that? Can we make them understand that?
Yes, absolutely. And so we got a lot of questions. David, do you want to have some final comments?
Well, this is actually a really interesting conversation around the future of, if you will, preservation of important languages. And it's actually a critical issue for so many cultures, isn't it? Native American societies, likewise, indigenous populations all over the world are wrestling with these very important issues. And some of them have very good funding, but you can't force populations to learn a language. It's very difficult to do that over large scale, yes, over large amounts of time, but generally people use the languages they want to use. And so, but what's interesting is, and I don't see this discussed much in terms of ancient languages, but technology is creating increasingly sophisticated translation capabilities, verbal as well as written. And so what may have once seemed like something very inaccessible, for only a select few scholars of only the best experts to be able to access literature or even spoken language, it's probably going to be a lot more easy for the general population of a particular community to, in the future, use technology to actually follow what's happening. So you could have a presentation in a certain language and have it automatically interpreted so you know what's going on and you're not left out. So you have a communal experience, and it may involve dance and music and so on. And instead of feeling dumb because you don't know it, you're like, oh, I know what's going on. So little kids will be able to enjoy that too. So I think that tech is going to potentially revolutionize this whole process. And I think that'd be an interesting topic maybe for another series in the future, Bahman.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
We have to, I really like Eden's idea about how to get the younger generation engaged in their history without forcing them to learn the language first. I think this is really a challenge, both for academia, Middle East studies. My wife teaches at University of Utah Persian, so there are Persian students from first year 9, they become 4, they become 5 later. It is really important to engage them in their history. So definitely we should have another series of discussions, roundtable on this subject. And Eden, that was really a pleasure to host you today. I'm so grateful to Ambassador John Lindbergh, who I assume was a former student of your late husband, right?
He was, yes. And John and I trained to go into the Peace Corps in Iran.
Yes.
I went to Afghanistan, he went to Iran. So I know John before that as well, yes.
He's been a great member of our board. I'm so glad he connected us. And I don't know if you saw the comment from James Good, another Peace Corps volunteer in Iran who's just written this fantastic book, Living, Loving Iran, also talks about some of the things you're doing. So with that, I really want to thank you for this fantastic presentation. We are recording it, we will edit it, get it all set up for anyone else who was not able to attend, and we'll send it to you, and look
Okay.
forward to have you in future panels.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, for moderating and chairing our panel today.
It was really, really great experience. Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.